I'm Lydia. I'm 35. And my own mother had me locked in a psychiatric hospital just to shut me up. I used to think there was nothing in the world I feared more than losing someone I loved. Then I found out what it feels like to lose your own identity, your autonomy, your voice. All because someone you trusted, someone who raised you, decided that your truth was too dangerous to be heard. If you've ever experienced something like this, comment below and subscribe. The day it started felt like any other. My daughter Zoe was sitting cross-legged on the kitchen floor, humming as she drew hearts around a stick figure drawing of me, her, and her dad, Dean. I was sipping lukewarm coffee, trying to shake off a restless night. The morning sun came through the windows in golden slices, catching on Zoe's curls as she babbled about her dreams. It should have been one of those perfect little moments you lock away in your heart. Then I saw the enveloped IT was on the porch, tucked neatly against the door. No postage. No return address. Just my name written in tight, sharp penmanship. Lydia Hart. I opened it, confused but not yet alarmed. What I read made my breath catch in my throat. It was a court order. A legal petition for an emergency psychiatric hold. Involuntary evaluation. 72 hours minimum. My knees buckled, and I sat right there on the top step, fingers trembling, the words on the page swimming in front of me. It couldn't be real. There had to be a mistake. I wasn't sick. I wasn't a threat to myself or anyone. I was a mother, a wife, a registered nurse. I paid taxes. I packed lunch boxes. What the hell was going on? Before I could even process it, there was a knock at the door. .2 officers, .1 man, 1 woman. They were calm, rehearsed, polite but firm. Mrs. Lydia Hart? The woman asked. I nodded slowly, still holding the paper like it might vanish if I crumpled it tight enough. We're here to escort you to Ridgeview for an evaluation, the man said. Like he was asking me to step into an Uber, not a psychiatric institution. You've been named in a court-ordered mental health petition. We need you to come with us now. Wait, I said, already backing away. There's been some mistake. I didn't do anything. I'm fine. I have a daughter. My daughter's here. Please, I need to call my husband. They exchanged glances. The woman stepped forward. We'll make sure someone stays with your daughter. You can't delay, ma'am. I remember feeling like the floor beneath me had liquefied. My body was moving, but I wasn't in it anymore. I was watching from somewhere above as they guided me gently but insistently to the police car. Zoe ran to the door, screaming, "Mommy? Mommy, where are you going?" I turned around one last time to see her small, tear-streaked face pressed against the glass. That image has never left me. They brought me to Ridgeview. I was fingerprinted, processed, stripped of everything: my shoes, my purse, my cell phone. Even the hair tie I kept on my wrist. Contraband, they called it. I was handed a pair of gray cotton pants and a top that didn't fit. I was locked in a room that smelled of bleach and sadness. The walls were the color of cigarette ash. The mattress was plastic. I didn't sleep. I couldn't. I asked for a phone call. I asked to call Dean to make sure Zoe was safe. The nurse shook her head. You're under observation. That'll be reviewed after your intake session. I asked what that meant. She didn't answer. I lay awake the entire night, my heart thudding so loudly I thought it would rupture. I stared at the ceiling, trying to understand. Who had done this? What had they said? And how in God's name had it worked? The second day, they brought me into a room with a young psychiatrist who introduced himself as Dr. Markman. He asked me about my sleep, my appetite, if I'd been hearing voices, if I thought people were watching me. I answered calmly. I was terrified, but I knew better than to show it. One wrong word and they'd label me. That much I understood. He flipped through a manila file as I sat there, and then I saw it, the page with the petition. The signature, Ruth Whitmore de M.Y. Mother. M.Y. Mother had signed the petition that landed me here. I stopped breathing. The walls felt like they were folding in. Dr. Markman was still speaking, but I couldn't hear a word. The sound in my ears was like a freight train barreling through. I wanted to scream. to ask why, to demand to know how she could do this to me. But I didn't. Instead, I asked to go back to my room, back to my gray cell, back to the silence. And that's when something inside me broke, or maybe it didn't break, it woke up, because up until that moment, I had spent my life trying to be the good daughter, the dependable one, the one who never made waves. I did what I was told. I married a man she approved of. I became a nurse like she wanted. I gave her a granddaughter she could show off like a trophy, and none of it mattered. Because when it came down to it, when she was cornered, she was willing to destroy me. Why? What did she think I knew? What truth had I stumbled upon that scared her so much she'd rather label me insane than let me speak it? I didn't know the answer yet. But I would, and when I did, I wouldn't just survive this. I would expose her. I would drag the truth out of the shadows and into the courtroom. Into the light. Into a place where she couldn't manipulate the narrative, where her charm wouldn't save her, and her name wouldn't protect her. She wanted me silent. But I was done being quiet. She had locked me away, thinking she'd buried me. She had no idea she was planting a seed, and I was going to grow back with thorns. They say your life flashes before your eyes in moments of trauma. But inside Ridgeview, what flashed before me wasn't my life. It was my childhood. Each memory, previously sweet and comforting, now twisted under the weight of this betrayal. My mother, Ruth Whitmore, was never cruel in the ways people typically recognize. No yelling. No bruises. Just a suffocating kind of control that wore the mask of love. She was refined, educated, the kind of woman who brought homemade pastries to PTA meetings and quoted Virginia Woolf like scripture. She knew how to be adored, respected, believed when she told the court I was unwell, unstable, paranoid. Of course they listened. Why wouldn't they? That second night at Ridgeview, I sat alone in the common room, which was anything but common. A few people mumbled to themselves. A woman in the corner was pacing and whispering into her cupped hands. I kept to a corner, watching the shadows move across the walls, my thoughts racing. I began to remember the subtle ways my mother had always bent the world to her will, like when I was 8 and told her my piano teacher had touched me in a way that felt wrong. She didn't comfort me. She didn't call the police. She tightened her lips and said, "Don't ever say that again, Lydia. Do you understand? Do you know what something like that could do to a man's reputation?" I had nodded. I didn't understand then, not really. But I knew how to survive in her house. You nodded. You smiled. You buried the truth so deep inside, you forgot what it looked like. And when I got older, when I fell in love with Dean, a mechanic, not a doctor or a lawyer like she'd hoped, I saw that same tight-lipped disapproval return. She smiled at our wedding, but afterward, she told me, "Well, I hope you won't regret choosing so far beneath your potential." I didn't regret Dean. I never did. He was kind, steady, the one person in my life who made me feel safe in my own skin, and now I was locked away, and I couldn't even reach him. It wasn't until the third day that I met someone who helped me understand what my mother was really doing. Her name was Marta. She was in her mid-50s, with a silver streak in her braid and eyes that didn't miss a thing. She'd been in Ridgeview for 2 weeks already, held under a similar emergency order. "My son says I'm paranoid," she told me, laughing bitterly over soggy eggs in the cafeteria. But he wasn't the one whose husband took out a second mortgage and tried to hide it. When I found the paperwork, suddenly I was the problem. We ate breakfast together every day after that. Marta didn't pry, and I was grateful. We exchanged stories in pieces, like bartering for sanity. When I finally told her about my mother, her lips curled into a knowing smile. "Oh, honey," she said, her voice soft but firm, "they always look like saints. The ones who do the most damage. But power doesn't always come from fists. Sometimes it comes from reputation. From perception. And your mother? She's a master." I leaned in, whispering, "How did she even get the court to approve this?" "I haven't done anything. You don't have to. That's the thing. All she had to do was build a narrative. A few suggestions here and there. Maybe tell them you've been forgetting things. That you've been erratic. It's not hard to get a judge to sign off on a 72-hour hold. And once you're in, every minute you protest just makes you look crazier. I felt cold all over. Marta's eyes narrowed. She's hiding something, and she thinks you're going to blow it open. That was the first moment I felt clarity. Like something inside me shifted into place. Marta was right. This wasn't about protecting me. This wasn't about my mental health. It was about control, and suddenly I knew exactly what had started this. It had nothing to do with Dean. Nothing to do with my daughter. It had everything to do with my father. He died 2 years ago. Complications from Parkinson's. He had always been quiet, gentle, content to let my mother run things. I had adored him as a child. He was the one who taught me how to ride a bike, who took me to the science museum while Mom was at her book club. But in the final year of his life, he changed. He started making small, strange comments when my mother wasn't in the room. "She lies better than anyone I've ever met," he said once, during a rare moment of lucidity. "There are things you don't know, Lydia. About our family. About the house. About the money. Be careful." I'd brushed it off. I thought he was confused, his mind slipping away. But now I remembered something else. 6 weeks before my mother had me committed, I'd found an old journal tucked away in a box of my father's things in the attic. His handwriting, full of fragmented thoughts. Mentions of a trust fund, a property in Vermont. Names I didn't recognize. I took pictures of the pages. I meant to ask my mother about it. But when I brought it up casually over coffee, she smiled a little too tightly. "Oh, that? Just more of his nonsense." Poor man was so confused in the end. I hadn't pushed. I should have. Because now I knew those pages were the reason I was here. She had seen the questions in my eyes. She knew I wouldn't stop digging. So she did what she always did. She took control. But she made one mistake. She underestimated me. After 5 days, I was evaluated again. Dr. Markman admitted there were no signs of psychosis. No delusions. "You seem coherent and self-aware," he said. "But your mother described concerning behavior, paranoia, obsessive thinking, claims of being followed." "I wasn't being followed," I said, keeping my voice calm. "I was looking into some financial records my father left behind. My mother was upset that I found them." He frowned. "Are you suggesting she manipulated the system?" "I'm suggesting," I said, leaning forward, "that you're looking at the wrong person." 2 more days passed. Finally, I was released. No apologies. No explanations. Just a plastic bag of my belongings and a cab voucher. When I stepped outside, the sun was too bright. The world felt too loud. I blinked into the daylight, but I wasn't the same woman who had been dragged from her kitchen 7 days ago. I was still now. The first thing I did when I got home, after wrapping Zoe in my arms and promising her I would never, ever disappear again, was open my laptop and pull up those pictures of the journal. I emailed every image to a lawyer I knew from the hospital, Thomas Leary, someone I'd met years ago when we worked on a malpractice review board together. I explained everything in the email, every detail. Then I called Dean. I didn't cry. I didn't shake. I told him I had work to do. That our family had been manipulated. That the woman who once braided my hair and told me monsters weren't real was the biggest monster of all, and I was going to take her to court, not for revenge, for truth. The strange thing about betrayal is how quiet it feels once the shock settles. It's not loud or violent. It's slow and suffocating, like drowning in still water. That's what the days after my release felt like. I was technically free, but the world didn't feel any less hostile. Especially not with my mother still out there, pretending nothing had happened. The morning after I got home, I sat at the kitchen table while Zoe built a Lego castle on the floor. She hadn't let me out of her sight since I returned. Even in her sleep, her little hand would reach out to check if I was there. Dean was quiet, cautious. I couldn't blame him. His world had been flipped upside down. One day his wife was home packing lunches. The next, she was ripped away in handcuffs under claims of mental instability. He'd been left with nothing but confusion and the carefully curated lies my mother had spun in my absence. I tried to call. He told me that morning, voice tight with guilt. "They wouldn't let me speak to you." Then your mother came by. She said you were unwell, that you were paranoid. She told me not to fight it, that it would only make things worse. He looked at me across the table, as if searching for a crack in my face. And I believed her. "Lydia, I'm so sorry." I reached across the table and took his hand. "It wasn't your fault." That's what she does. She wraps her lies in ribbons and presents them as truth. But what I didn't say, what I couldn't say yet, was how afraid I was that this was only the beginning. I didn't have to wait long for confirmation. 3 days after I returned home, I got a letter in the mail. From my mother's lawyer, a cease and desist. She was accusing me of slander and harassment. The letter claimed I had made defamatory remarks to third parties regarding Mrs. Ruth Whitmore's character and integrity, including false accusations of fraud and abuse. They threatened legal action if I continued. I stared at the letter, rage building like fire behind my eyes. She wanted me silent. Still, that same evening, I took a deep breath, logged into my old Gmail, and reopened the folder where I'd uploaded the photos of my father's journal. There were over 40 pages. Sloppy handwriting, scribbled thoughts, cryptic notes. But there was one entry I kept coming back to. March 17th, Ruth transferred $40,000 to a shell account under the name RM Holdings. Says it's for estate restructuring. I asked her why I hadn't heard about it sooner. She said I was confused again. I'm not. I checked twice. Something's wrong. I Googled RM Holdings. Nothing. Then I pulled up the county property records and typed in my parents' address. That's when I saw it. 3 months before my father's death, he'd quietly removed my mother's name from the deed, and 2 months after he died, 6 weeks after the funeral, while I was still barely functioning, she filed a forged document to put her name back on the title. It was sloppy, but it had slipped through, and that was just the beginning. I printed every page, every email, every record I could find. Then I sent it all to Thomas Leary, the attorney I'd contacted after my release. He called me within the hour. "Lydia," he said, voice low and grave, "you might have more than just a civil case here. What you're describing, this could be criminal. Fraud. Forgery. And given how she manipulated a mental health petition against you, potentially perjury." I swallowed hard. "Can we prove it?" "If we subpoena the right documents and the original deed records, yes. But we're going to need to act fast and carefully. Your mother clearly knows you're digging." That cease and desist was a scare tactic. But it tells me she's afraid. Afraid. I wanted her to be terrified, because the more I uncovered, the more I realized this went far beyond a bitter mother-daughter rift, and why Mother wasn't just a controlling woman with a superiority complex. She was a liar. A thief. A manipulator who had orchestrated my disappearance the moment I got close to the truth. But I wasn't going to let her bury me again. I began documenting everything. I wrote a full affidavit, cataloging every encounter, from the day I found my father's journal to the moment the police took me away. I backed it up with text messages, emails, photos of the journal pages, and even voicemail recordings. I created a timeline. A map of every financial transaction my father had made in his last year of life. It was tedious and painful, but I felt like I was finally reclaiming something, my voice. The scariest part came 2 weeks later, when Thomas arranged to serve my mother with a preliminary injunction. He warned me to stay away from her. She's smart. "Lydia, cornered animals are dangerous. Let us do this the right way." I agreed, but deep down I knew she would come to me. She always did. Sure enough, 3 nights after the legal notice was delivered, there was a knock at my door. I opened it to find her standing there, wearing a tailored beige coat and a silk scarf. Like she'd just come from brunch, not legal warfare. Her expression was calm. Controlled. "Lydia," she said softly. "May I come in?" Dean stepped forward protectively. "You're not welcome here." My mother smiled, cold and thin. This is between me and my daughter. I held up my hand to Dean. It's okay. He hesitated, then stepped aside. She walked into our living room like she owned it. Like nothing had happened. I assume you've hired a lawyer, she said, settling herself into an armchair without invitation. I did, I replied. I assume you've been advised not to speak to me directly. She smiled. Oh, Lydia. Always so dramatic. This little crusade of yours, do you really think it will change anything? I stared at her. You committed fraud. You forged a property document. You used a mental health petition to try to have your own daughter locked away. She shrugged. It's your word against mine. I have the documents, Mother. I have the journal. The records. I have Dad's handwritten notes, and I have witnesses who remember you bragging about how you took care of everything after his death. You're not going to win this time. Her eyes sharpened. Just for a moment, I saw the truth flicker through, the fear, the rage, then it was gone. You don't know what you're doing, she said, her voice now quiet and dangerous. You're poking a bear, Lydia. And bears bite. Good, I said, stepping closer. Because I'm done playing dead. She stood, straightened her coat, and walked to the door. Before leaving, she turned back. If you think the court will side with a woman who just got out of a psych ward over a respected community figure with a 30-year reputation, you're more naive than I thought. I smiled. We'll let the evidence speak for itself. She left without another word. I locked the door behind her and turned to Dean, who looked like he'd just witnessed a ghost walk through the house. Are you okay? He asked. I took a deep breath. No, I said. But I will be. That night, as Zoe slept upstairs and Dean sat beside me holding my hand, I pulled out the folder I'd compiled and wrote across the front in bold black marker, "Case file, Ruth Whitmore," because the next time she walked into a courtroom, it wouldn't be to lock me away. IT would be to answer for everything she'd tried to bury. The thing about revenge is that the best kind doesn't look like revenge. It looks like paperwork. Like calm voices and courtroom decorum. Like well-constructed affidavits and a smile that doesn't quite reach the eyes. Why Mother had no idea that by locking me up, she'd opened a door she could never close again. She had made me dangerous, not with violence, not with threats, but with truth, precision, and patience. I and the weeks that followed her dramatic visit to my house. The legal process began to unfold. We filed a petition in civil court to challenge the property transfer. Thomas, my attorney, was surgical in how he constructed the case. Every document we submitted had 2 copies of backup. My father's will. The original deed to the house. The forged paperwork filed 6 weeks after his death. And, most importantly, the forensic handwriting analysis we had commissioned, one that clearly showed the signature on the deed retransfer was not my father's. We also filed for a formal audit of the family trust. That was where it got interesting. My father's trust, which had been established when I was 17, was meant to benefit both my mother and me. 50-50. I remembered him telling me that over dinner after my high school graduation. It's not much now, Lydia, he had said, but someday you'll be glad for it. You'll use it to send your kids to college or start a business. Whatever you want. But according to the trustees' recent records that had been altered, only one beneficiary remained, Ruth Whitmore. When I asked Thomas how that could happen, he explained bluntly, she either forged an amendment, or she bullied your father into revising it when he was cognitively declining. Either way, we'll find out. Meanwhile, I started playing a different game. While the lawyers handled the formalities, I began showing up at places where my mother's image still held power, her church, her garden club, the women's council she chaired at the local library, not to cause a scene. Never that, just to be seen. I wore modest clothes, kept my tone soft, my smile measured. And when people asked how I was, I didn't go into specifics. I simply said, I'm recovering. It's been a difficult time, but I trust the truth is coming. That was it, just enough to plant seeds. In small towns, truth doesn't need a microphone. It needs a whisper, The first crack appeared when my mother's former best friend, Denise Loring, called me one Saturday afternoon. "I just want to say, I didn't know," she said, her voice trembling. "I didn't know she'd done that to you. We all thought you were going through something. She made it sound like you were delusional, that you were having a breakdown. But now," she trailed off. "I waited. She cornered me after church last week," Denise continued. "Asked if I'd been talking to you. Then she said you were dangerous, that you'd fabricated all this to punish her. But I've known you since you were 10. And I saw your father at the end. He wasn't well. If she pushed him to change that trust, well, I believe you." That single conversation broke a dam. Over the next month, 3 more of my mother's closest allies began to pull away from her. Quietly. Some offered me guarded support. Others said nothing at all but canceled lunches with her, skipped her book club. I didn't need them to take sides publicly. I just needed her to feel the walls closing in. The real turning point came the day I got a call from the paralegal at Thomas's office. "Lydia," she said, barely containing her excitement. "We've got it." "What?" "The original trust documents. Your father's lawyer kept a scanned copy of the version signed 2 years ago. It names both you and your mother as equal beneficiaries. The amended version that your mother submitted has a different signature and formatting. It's almost certainly a forgery." My heart dropped into my stomach. "You're sure?" "Positive. We're requesting a deposition." That was when I started preparing myself not just as a daughter seeking justice, but as a witness. Thomas began coaching me. We met twice a week in his office. We rehearsed potential questions. We reviewed every document. We went through timelines again and again. "This will not be easy," he warned me. "She'll have an attorney. She'll try to rattle you. She may even try to flip the narrative again, paint you as unstable, vindictive, delusional. Are you ready for that?" I looked him in the eye and said, "I've already been locked in a hospital against my will. What else can she do to me?" He nodded, satisfied. The deposition was scheduled for a Friday morning. We met in a cold conference room downtown. The opposing counsel arrived first. Harold Ginsley, a smug man with gray eyebrows and an expensive watch. He gave me a pitying smile that I wanted to slap off his face. Then my mother walked in. She wore navy blue. Her makeup was flawless. Her smile was confident, but her eyes flicked over me with something new, uncertainty. She hadn't expected me to be calm, or prepared, or surrounded by a legal team. The court reporters swore us in, and then the questioning began. Thomas started gently, establishing background, my relationship to the property, the trust, the circumstances of my father's illness. I answered clearly, directly, never once raising my voice. Then came Ginsley's turn. "Ms. Hart," he began, "is it true that you were recently placed under psychiatric evaluation?" "Yes," I said. "And how long were you hospitalized?" 7 days. "And do you believe that experience affects your credibility in this matter?" I tilted my head. "Not unless the court believes that being falsely institutionalized by the defendant makes me less qualified to speak on her pattern of coercion and fraud." Thomas smiled behind his notes. Ginsley tried a new tactic. "Isn't it possible that you imagined your mother's intent? That perhaps she was simply trying to help you?" "Help me?" I asked. "By forging legal documents? By removing me from my home and child under false pretenses? That's not help. That's erasure." There was a silence then, a long one. My mother shifted in her seat. She'd never heard me speak like that before, and in that moment, I didn't care if she hated me. I wanted her to see who I had become without her leash around my neck. By the time we finished, Thomas whispered, "That was perfect." But I wasn't done. That night, I called the local paper that I asked to speak to the features editor, and I told her everything, off the record at first. Then, when she asked if I'd be willing to go on record once the case was filed publicly, I said yes. Because my mother had used the quiet to control me for years. It was time the world heard the noise. The truth doesn't need to shout. It just needs to last longer than the lie. I kept telling myself that in the weeks following the article's publication. The feature about me, my mother, and the silent war that was now a matter of public record had done more than I ever imagined. It had broken the illusion. The idea of Ruth Whitmore as an untouchable pillar of the community began to crumble, but my mother wasn't the type to go down quietly. She knew how to survive in a storm. She'd created most of the ones in our family, and now she was spinning one of her own. I saw the flyer on a community board downtown. The irony nearly made me laugh. An evening with Ruth Whitmore, speaking up for mental health awareness. Date, time, dress code. Proceeds benefiting some wellness nonprofit I'd never heard of. She had read my story in the paper, felt the shift in public sympathy, and pivoted. Just like that. Reinvented herself not as the villain, not even as the victim, but as the brave caregiver who had made a difficult but necessary decision to protect someone she loved. Me.it was disgusting. And strategic, she's trying to own the narrative, Thomas said when I showed him the invite. Let her. All she's doing is painting herself into a tighter legal corner. But I wasn't so sure. I knew her better than he did. She doesn't care about cornering herself, I said. She only cares about keeping her image intact long enough to discredit me before trial. I wasn't wronged. By the time her gala night arrived, several of her old friends, those who had gone silent after the article, were posting filtered photos from the event on Facebook, praising her courage, her commitment to destigmatizing mental illness. The same people who used to pull me aside to whisper how odd she was now clinked wine glasses with her under gold chandeliers. She spoke at the podium for 15 minutes. I didn't attend, of course, but clips surfaced online the next morning. She wore lavender. Her voice trembled with emotion at all the right moments. And in the middle of her speech, she said this: I was faced with a terrible decision. My daughter, whom I loved dearly, was unraveling. She wouldn't accept help. She was convinced I had betrayed her, that I was hiding things from her. She was angry, confused. I knew, as a mother, I had to act, even if she never forgave me for it. It was masterful. A masterclass in passive guilt, perfectly polished grief, and underlying condescension. Not a single direct accusation, just enough doubt to cast a shadow over everything I had said. Just enough to make people wonder, and it worked. For some. For a week after that speech, I received a trickle of emails, a few sympathetic, many skeptical. Maybe she didn't know how to help you. You seem very angry. Is that why she acted? It's hard to believe a mother would do something like that without cause. I didn't respond, but it reminded me of something Marta, the woman I met at Ridgeview, once said. They'll always believe the person who cries prettily before they believe the one who's still shaking with rage. I had shaken long enough that it was time to stop reacting and start reclaiming. We pressed forward with the case. Why attorney Thomas had unearthed more financial discrepancies in the estate. The trust, initially structured with clear, equal distributions between my mother and me, had been altered twice in its final year. The second revision, the one that excluded me, had no record of legal counsel involvement. No notarized signature. And worst of all for my mother, it directly contradicted the original will filed with probate court. The forgery charges were gaining weight. So were the civil fraud claims. But it was the quiet moves that changed the game. We began interviewing those closest to my mother during that period. Her bridge club friends. Her financial advisor. Even her housekeeper, who'd worked for the family for 17 years. None of them knew about the trust revisions, but 3 of them remembered a conversation. In late spring the year my father died, my mother had hosted a garden party. That afternoon, while discussing estate planning over lemonade, she had apparently said, I finally convinced him to simplify the trust. Lydia doesn't need it. She's always been too idealistic with money. It wasn't a smoking gun, but it was smoke. And where there's smoke, we gathered affidavits, compiled witness statements, built a case not just on the paper trail, but on the quiet admissions that no one thought would ever matter. And then the settlement offer came, again. This time it was bigger, 0.6 figures. Clean. Tax protected. Full non-disclosure clause. Mutual immunity. Everything wrapped in a pristine vow. Thomas asked me if I wanted to consider it. I know you want justice, he said. But you also want peace. Settling doesn't mean surrender. It just means choosing your battles. I looked at the document. At the promise of silence in exchange for security. At the chance to close the chapter and move on, but then I thought of Zoe. Of the way her face crumpled when she asked, "Is Grandma going to hurt you again?" I thought of being handcuffed in my own home. Of cold hospital beds. Of the sound of my daughter's sobs through the window as they drove me away, and I thought of my mother, standing on that stage in lavender, accepting applause for her bravery. I'm not settling, I said. Not because of pride, but because it wasn't just about me anymore. I wanted the truth in the record books. I wanted every woman who'd been gaslit, every child dismissed, every daughter erased, to know they weren't crazy. They weren't overreacting, they were just inconvenient, and they deserved better. Dean supported me, but I could see the toll it was taking. He wasn't a man who thrived in conflict. He wanted our life back. He wanted things to be quiet again, but he never once asked me to stop. Even on the days I broke down, questioning if it was worth it, he'd kneel beside me and say, "Whatever you need to finish this, we'll get through it." I knew he was tired. So was Ida, but we were close. The court date was set for 8 weeks out. In the meantime, I prepared like it was war, because in a way, it was not one of swords or blood, but of truths sharpened into arrows, and I was done standing still. The 8 weeks leading to the trial moved both too fast and agonizingly slow. One moment I was reviewing affidavits at the kitchen table while Zoe colored next to me. The next I was waking up in cold sweats from dreams of being locked behind hospital doors again. Every day was a contradiction. My body was tired, but my mind was racing. My heart thudded with fear, but also throbbed with determination. This wasn't just about justice anymore. It was about reclaiming the parts of myself that had been buried under years of manipulation. The parts that had learned silence as survival. That had been taught to mistrust my own instincts. Why Mother had spent a lifetime perfecting the art of the gentle lie. Now I was finally building my truth brick by brick in front of an audience she couldn't manipulate. The pretrial hearings were brutal. Her legal team filed motion after motion, trying to delay, dismiss, or reduce the scope of the charges. Thomas countered every time with precise rebuttals, his calm demeanor never wavering. "She's trying to exhaust you," he told me during one long afternoon. "It's a pressure tactic, designed to make you question if it's worth continuing." I did question it, more than once, especially when a letter arrived anonymously in my mailbox. A single sheet of paper, typed in all caps, "You're going to destroy your family over money. Shame on you, duh." An O signature. No return address. I turned it over in my hands, feeling the weight of every unspoken judgment behind it. Was that how people saw me? Greedy? Ungrateful? Bitter? No. I reminded myself. This wasn't about the money. Not for me. This was about the fact that she had taken my agency. She had stripped me of credibility. She had weaponized my trust. This wasn't about the inheritance. It was about the institutions that had helped her erase me and how I had clawed my way back, one truth at a time, but not everyone understood that. There were still people who crossed the street when they saw me, who looked down at their phones at the farmer's market instead of saying hello, but there were others too, like Marta, who sent me a letter from her sister's address. Handwritten, shaky but fierce. "You're doing what so many of us never could, Lydia. You're dragging it into the light. Whatever happens in court, you've already won something most of us only dream of, your voice back." I cried reading that. It reminded me that this fight wasn't just mine. 2 weeks before trial, I was called in for a final strategy meeting at Thomas's office. He'd printed out a timeline color-coded, cross-referenced with documents and testimony. Each event leading from my father's death to the forged deed. From the quiet transfer of funds from the trust to a suspicious new LLC bearing my mother's maiden name. From the journal entries I had found, all the way to the psychiatric hold she initiated against me. There, in black and white, was the full anatomy of her betrayal, and I would need to walk a jury through it. "You'll testify third," Thomas said. After our financial expert and the notary who confirmed your father's original will. Then we'll bring in your neighbor to testify about the day you were taken into custody. Ellen, I said, nodding. She saw everything. She's solid, he confirmed. Calm. Sympathetic. No exaggerations. Juries respond well to people like her. And Mom? I asked. She's on the list. They're still debating if she'll take the stand. My guess? She will. She's not the type to sit quietly. I nodded. She won't be able to resist. She'll want to control the room. Thomas gave a thin smile. Good. We'll be ready. On the day of the trial, I dressed deliberately, not flashy. Not make. A navy blouse, gray slacks, and my father's old watch, polished and reset to working order. The same one he used to wear when we went fishing, when we sat side by side reading in the family den. It felt like armor. Dean drove me to the courthouse. Neither of us spoke much during the ride. Zoe had stayed the night with his sister, unaware of just how significant this day was. All she knew was that Mommy was telling the truth to some very important people. I watched the buildings pass as we approached the courthouse. Concrete. Steel. Glass. It wasn't beautiful, but it was solid. Permanent. Unbending. That's what I wanted to be today. Solid, unbending. Inside, the courtroom was filled with quiet murmurs. Reporters sat near the back. Local news, mostly. A few community members I recognized. Even Denise, my mother's former friend, was there, arms folded across her chest, lips pressed in a firm line. When my mother entered, the room seemed to inhale. She wore black. Her expression was composed, almost mournful, like she was attending a funeral for a life someone else had ruined. I felt the heat rise in my chest, but I didn't flinch. I looked straight ahead. The judge, a woman with silver hair and sharp eyes, called the room to order, and the trial began. The first day was a blur of documents and testimonies. Thomas laid out our argument with precision, that Ruth Whitmore had systematically manipulated her late husband's trust, forged documents to exclude her only daughter from rightful inheritance, and used a fraudulent psychiatric petition to silence the one person who dared to question her. The financial expert confirmed what we already knew: multiple irregular withdrawals, the disappearance of nearly $200,000 over 12 months, and the convenient emergence of shell corporations linked to Ruth's name. The notary testified next, clearly stating she had not witnessed any updated trust documents in the 6 months before my father's death, contradicting the version my mother had submitted. Day 2, Ellen testified. She described the day I was taken into custody in painful detail. How Zoe screamed. How I begged the officers to let me call Dean. How my mother stood on the sidewalk, silent and unmoved, watching it unfold. She wasn't panicked, Ellen said. She wasn't distraught. She was satisfied. Then it was my turn. I walked to the stand, took the oath, and sat with my palms flat on my thighs to keep from shaking. Thomas walked me through it, gently at first. My upbringing, my relationship with my father, the promises he made about the trust, then the day I found the journal, and then the petition. I described the fear, the cold, the way Ridgeview swallowed me whole. How I didn't sleep for nights, not because I was unstable, but because I knew I was being erased. And then I turned to the jury. I'm not here today because I want revenge, I said, voice steady. I'm here because I was silenced. Because my mother decided that her legacy, her money, her image, was worth more than my autonomy. My daughter watched me be taken away in handcuffs because I dared to ask questions. I need to live in a world where that's not okay. There was silence when I stepped down, tears in a few eyes. Why mother didn't look at me. She stared straight ahead, cold, unbending, but inside, I hoped, finally, she was cracking. By the third day of the trial, the courtroom felt like a theater where everyone had started to memorize their roles. The judge remained unreadable, the jury increasingly alert, and the spectators, a curious mix of friends, foes, and nosy townspeople, filed in each morning with murmured anticipation, and at the center of it all was Ruth Whitmore, Sitting in tailored silence, her composure so practiced it would have fooled anyone who hadn't spent a lifetime trying to earn her approval, but even she couldn't control everything anymore, because today she was going to take the stand. Her attorneys had debated the risk. They knew the facts weren't on their side. Too much evidence of forgery, too many inconsistencies in her story, too many witnesses undermining the saintly image she tried to project. But Ruth wasn't the kind of woman who let others speak for her. She still believed that if she could look the jury in the eye, she could convince them of her innocence. She had done it her entire life. She believed in the power of her voice. What she didn't realize was that mine had grown stronger than hers. She walked to the witness box like a matriarch on her way to a coronation. Dignified, elegant, and utterly certain she could bend this moment to her will, her attorney opened with a gentle line of questioning. Background, family values, her role in the community, how much she loved her husband, how deeply she cared for me even in my difficult times. She leaned into the maternal narrative. It broke my heart, she said, dabbing at a tearless eye, to watch my daughter spiral. Lydia is brilliant. She's always been so capable. But after my husband passed, something in her changed. She became obsessed with the idea that I had stolen from her, that I had manipulated his wishes. It wasn't true, but she wouldn't hear it. She started accusing me, questioning every decision I made. She paused, glancing at the jury, then back at her lawyer. I tried everything. I suggested therapy. I even brought her tea one afternoon, hoping we could talk like we used to. But she screamed at me, said I was trying to poison her. That's when I knew she needed help. She said it with such sadness, such artful restraint, that for a moment I could almost see how she'd fooled so many people for so long, but not this time. Thomas rose for cross-examination. Walking to the center of the courtroom with a calm that masked the blade he was about to unsheath, Mrs. Whitmore, he began, you testified that you initiated an involuntary psychiatric hold for your daughter because you believed she was mentally unwell, correct? Yes, she said softly, and you're not a medical professional? No, so you had no formal diagnosis to support that action? I had concerns. Serious ones. Concerns that your daughter was delusional? Yes. He turned, retrieved a stack of papers from our exhibit folder, and held them up. Can you explain, then, why you filed the mental health petition less than 48 hours after your daughter discovered handwritten notes from her late father indicating discrepancies in the family trust? I wasn't aware of those notes. No? Because we have text messages you sent to your sister that same evening, attached here in Exhibit 42, in which you said, quote, Lydia found the journal. I told her it was ramblings, but she won't let it go. I'll handle it. She blinked. Silence. Thomas let the moment stretch. Does that refresh your memory? She shifted slightly in her seat. I didn't mean it like that. How did you mean it? I meant I'd try to help her see reason. By having her committed? Her attorney objected, leading. The judge allowed it, but the damage was done. The jury had heard it. Thomas continued, slower now, more deliberate. Mrs. Whitmore, when you filed the petition to have your daughter institutionalized, did you tell the judge that you were in the process of updating the family trust? No. Did you disclose that a notary had refused to witness the new version because your husband was no longer competent? I didn't think it was relevant. Interesting. So you were concerned enough to have your daughter removed from her home by police, but not concerned enough to mention that you stood to gain financially from her absence. She looked directly at the judge. That's not why I did it. Then why forge a deed placing your name back on the house after your husband removed you from it a year prior? I did not forge, Mrs. Whitmore, Thomas said, walking toward her now. A forensic handwriting analyst has testified under oath that your husband's signature on that deed is not authentic, that it bears signs of tremors inconsistent with his condition at the time, that the notary's logbook for that date contains no entry for such a document. Are you saying they are all lying? Her voice cracked for the first time. My husband wanted to protect me. He didn't trust Lydia to manage things. And yet his journal, which was admitted into evidence without objection, states clearly that he was worried you were moving money without his knowledge. That he feared you would cut your daughter out. She didn't respond. Mrs. Whitmore, did you use your position in the community to influence the court into approving an emergency hold based on exaggerated claims of instability? I was trying to protect her. Or were you trying to protect yourself? Objection sustained. Thomas stepped back. No further questions. She didn't look at me as she stepped down. For the first time, her mask slipped, and I saw not the composed matriarch, but the frightened woman beneath, clutching desperately at the last threads of a story unraveling faster than she could sew it back together. That night, I didn't sleep. I lay awake, staring at the ceiling, remembering every quiet insult, every carefully placed doubt she'd sown into my childhood. You're too emotional. Don't be dramatic. And no one else seems to have a problem with me, maybe. The problem is you. Now the world had heard her say those things under oath. Now she had to answer to someone besides me. I went into the 4th day of the trial exhausted but resolute. The final witnesses testified. The judge gave her instructions. And then it went to the jury. The deliberation lasted 9 hours. Every tick of the clock was a weight pressing down on my chest. But when they returned, the air shifted. I knew before they even spoke. The foreperson stood, voice steady. We find in favor of the plaintiff, Lydia Hart, on all counts. I didn't cry. Not yet. I looked at Dean, who squeezed my hand so tight I almost laughed. My mother sat still, lips pursed, eyes blanked. It was over, but not really, because justice is not a finish line, it's a beginning outside the courthouse. The reporters gathered. I gave one brief statement. I didn't do this to destroy her. I did it to protect myself, to protect my daughter, and to show others that silence isn't safety. Speaking the truth is the only way to survive. I meant every word. Later, at home, I held Zoe as she asked, "Does this mean we're safe now?" I pulled her close. "Yes," I whispered. "We're safe. We're free." But in my heart, I knew what I'd learned. Freedom doesn't come all at once. It comes in pieces. I encouraged. I had hard truths spoken in soft voices, and sometimes it comes in courtrooms. When the people who spent a lifetime silencing you are finally forced to listen, you don't really understand what fallout means until you live through it. Not the courtroom version. Not the press conferences or verdict summaries. I'm talking about the slow-motion implosion that happens afterward, when the headlines fade and everyone else returns to their lives, but you're still sitting in the ashes, trying to rebuild yours. After the trial, the community reacted like I'd expected. Divided, buzzing, opinionated. Half of them celebrated the verdict, citing it as overdue justice, a long-awaited reckoning. The other half treated me like I'd committed a social sin worse than fraud, airing family laundry. Not just any families, but the Whitmores. The town's golden ones. They didn't care about forged documents or psychological abuse. What bothered them was that I had said it out loud, in public, under oath. She should have handled it privately, one woman muttered behind me in line at the bank. "I just think it's sad," another said to her friend at the farmer's market. What she did to her poor mother. But they didn't know the real story. The nights I spent pacing an 8x10 cell wondering if I'd ever see my daughter again. The mornings I woke in cold sweats, still hearing the sterile beep of the hospital monitor above my head. The weight of having your reality questioned so thoroughly that even you begin to doubt it. Still, I didn't try to defend myself to those people. I had no more words to give them. The truth had already been said, under oath, under scrutiny, and under the unwavering eye of the court. Let them whisper. Let them squirm. I wasn't going back into silence. The court's ruling granted full restitution of my inheritance. The trust was split retroactively, all misappropriated funds ordered to be returned. In addition, my mother faced criminal charges for the forgery and perjury, charges still pending, as the criminal case wound through its own system. For now, she was out on bail, but her social circle had shrunk to a tight few who whispered about misunderstandings and family drama behind her back, then canceled their brunches quietly when the DA announced an indictment. I didn't celebrate. Not the way you'd think. There were no champagne toasts, no triumphant speeches. Just a long bath the night after the verdict, followed by the first 8 hours of uninterrupted sleep I'd had in months. But rest wasn't peace. That part took longer. Dean and I had been drifting. Not in anger, but in exhaustion. He'd stood by me, yes. Supported me. Defended me. But something between us had shifted in the months I'd spent buried in legal documents and trauma recovery. He was a mechanic, a man of actions, not words. He wanted life to return to normal, and I had learned there was no such thing anymore. "Do you want to talk about it?" he asked one night as we sat on the couch, a crime show flickering in the background. I stared at the screen, then at him. "I don't think I can go back to who I was before." He nodded slowly. "I know. I don't even know who I am now." "You're someone who stood up when everyone expected you to shut up," he said. "That's someone I'm proud to know, even if we both need to figure out how to find each other again." It wasn't a solution, but it was honest. And that was enough for now. Zoe, in her own way, was healing too. She was young, but not naive. Children know when something isn't right. They feel tension the way trees feel wind. Before it breaks anything, they sense it bending the world. At night, she still asked the same question. "Are we okay now?" And every night, I'd answer, "We are." Even when I wasn't sure. Even when the shadows still lingered at the edges of my thoughts. Because children need something to believe in. And sometimes, you have to speak the future into existence until it finally arrives. My mother, surprisingly, stayed silent. No appeals. No letters. No confrontation. It felt less like defeat and more like retreat. A strategy to wait out the scandal and reemerge later with another version of the truth. One she could peddle to anyone still willing to listen. But I wasn't worried. She could rewrite the story in her own circles if she wanted. But legally, publicly, and irrevocably, it was mine now, and I had no intention of giving it back. The criminal trial date was set 6 months out. In the meantime, I met with a trauma counselor twice a week. Not just to process the hospital, but everything. My upbringing. The years of subtle, corrosive damage that led to this moment. She built her entire world around control. The therapist told me during our 3rd session. She created an ecosystem where love was conditional and silence was rewarded. You broke the rules by surviving. That's why she had to punish you. The insight was hard to swallow. But it explained so much. The way she'd always framed my independence as rebellion. The way she'd insisted she knew what was best for me even when I had begged her to listen. The way she had tried to erase me, first metaphorically, then legally. That it was never about my mental health. That it was about my autonomy, and the cost of reclaiming it was steep, but I was willing to pay it. One evening, I visited my father's grave. It was the first time I'd gone alone since his funeral. I stood there for a long time, my fingers tracing the cool edges of his name carved in stone. "I found it. Dad," I whispered. "Everything you tried to hide from me. I found it." She didn't win. The wind rustled through the trees. For the first time, I didn't feel like I was visiting a tomb. I felt like I was returning something to him. His truth. His voice. His trust in me. When I left the cemetery, I didn't cry. I smiled, a small one. But real. 1 month before my mother's criminal trial, I received an enveloped NO return address. Inside was a single handwritten note. "Lydia, there are things I cannot undo. You were never meant to carry the whole story." But it was never just mine either. NO apology, NO admission, just a sliver of regret, folded into riddles and wrapped in that signature Ruth Whitmore ambiguity. I read it once. Then I shredded it, not out of anger, but out of clarity, because I finally understood. I wasn't looking for her to say, "I'm sorry" anymore. I was looking to never need her approval again. That, more than any verdict, was the real victory. As her trial approached, my mother stopped showing up to her club meetings. Her name was quietly removed from the community garden board. And when the local paper ran a piece titled, "From Legacy to Liability, the Ruth Whitmore Case," even her remaining defenders faded into silence. Meanwhile, I started writing again. Not for the court, not for the press. For me. I wrote the story as it happened, Yes, but also the parts one had suppressed for years. The whispered moments, the manipulated memories, the things that, once written, could never again be hidden, and for the first time in my adult life, I felt like I was creating something entirely my own, unfiltered, unapproved, and unapologetic. People started reaching out, survivors, daughters, mothers, men who had been discredited by powerful spouses, women who had been called crazy because they dared to speak hard truths. They didn't all share the same details, but they shared the same ache, the same desperation to be believed, and the same quiet, breathless joy of finally finding someone who understood. And in those emails, I found a new purpose. I wasn't just reclaiming my story, I was helping others reclaim theirs. That, I realized, was something my mother could never silence. Closure isn't clean. It doesn't come wrapped in apologies or punctuated with redemption. For most of us, closure arrives as quietly as the pain it replaces, subtle, unsettling, and so ordinary you almost miss it. The criminal trial began on a rainy Monday in October. The courthouse steps were slick with wet leaves, and the gray sky seemed fitting for what was about to unfold inside. This time, I wasn't the one fighting to be believed. This time, the state carried the burden. I sat behind the prosecutor's table as a witness, not a plaintiff. But emotionally, I was just as invested. Maybe more. My mother faced 2 felony charges: fraudulent document filing and perjury. She pled not guilty, of course. Her defense leaned into the same old narrative: confusion, compassion, the complexities of family dynamics. Her lawyers tried to paint the deed forgery as a clerical miscommunication. The false statements during my mental health petition? A mother's desperate attempt to help her daughter. But that time, the jury didn't buy it. The prosecution had timelines, financial records, handwriting analysis, my father's journal. They had motive and manipulation, and a witness who no longer trembled when she spoke. When I took the stand, I told them what she did, and I told them what it cost. I'm not here today as a daughter looking for revenge, I said. I'm here as a citizen asking the court to acknowledge something that happens too often, too quietly. Abuse doesn't always come with bruises. Sometimes it comes with paperwork, with silence, with control. And sometimes it wears pearls and hosts charity luncheons. Some members of the jury nodded, others looked at me with that quiet mixture of empathy and horror that only comes when someone realizes how close a story like mine might hit to home. After 3 days of testimony and a final closing statement that made even the clerk pause, the jury returned their verdict: guilty. On both counts. She didn't cry, she didn't speak, she just sat there, lips pressed together, hands folded neatly in her lap. Her hair was a little thinner than it used to be, the color more muted, her eyes slightly dulled by the fatigue of losing a war she had always believed she'd win. The judge sentenced her to 5 years probation, community service, a permanent criminal record, and mandatory restitution payments to the trust. No jail time. Some people were disappointed by that, but not me. I didn't need bars to feel free. The real sentence was that for the rest of her life, her name would carry a shadow. Not the kind whispered behind closed doors. The kind written in public record. She couldn't erase me anymore. Not legally, not socially, not psychologically. The world had seen her for who she was, and I no longer needed her to see me. In the months that followed, life didn't magically fall into place. But for the first time, I got to decide what the pieces would look like. Dean and I started couples therapy. We weren't broken, but we'd both been holding our breath for too long, and it was time to exhale together. We talked about everything. About my fear of not being heard, his fear of not knowing how to help, the trauma of helplessness, the exhaustion of constant survival. It wasn't always easy. Some sessions were painful. But every time we walked out of that room, fingers still interlocked, we were stronger. Zoe turned 7. She wore a sparkly crown to her birthday party, built a cardboard castle in the living room, and told her friends her mom was the bravest person in the world. I didn't correct her. She didn't know what bravery cost. but she had lived inside the storm it required. And she still reached for light. That was enough. 6 months after the criminal trial ended, I was invited to speak at a local advocacy group's conference. The theme was restoring autonomy, voices that refused to be silenced. I almost said no to, I wasn't a public speaker. I wasn't an activist. I was just a woman who survived her own mother, but then I remembered the letters I'd received after my story first came out. The messages from other daughters, sons, siblings, spouses. People who had been erased by those who claimed to love them. People still afraid. I didn't want to speak for them. I wanted them to know they could speak for themselves. I said yes. The day of the conference, I stood on a modest stage in front of 100 strangers and shared my truth again. Not because I needed them to hear it, but because I needed to hear myself say it out loud. The moment I finished, there was a pause, then applause, then someone stood, then another, and just like that, something cracked open inside me. Not the pain, not the memory, but the weight. It lifted, not completely. It never does, but just enough to. I still get mail from my mother, not often. 3 times in the year since her conviction. Short notes. Cryptic. Hollow. Always unsigned. The last one simply said, "I hope you're happy now." It didn't anger me. It didn't haunt me. I folded it in half, tossed it in the trash, and went back to helping Zoe with her science project about stars. That night, she asked, "Do you think the stars get scared when they're alone in the dark?" I smiled. "No," I said. "Because even when you can't see them, they're still shining." That's what healing is. Not erasing the dark, but learning you can still burn anyway. And why Mother eventually moved to a different town. Quietly. No party. No goodbye. Just a change of address request and a house listed on the market. Some people whispered that she was starting over. Others whispered that she had finally run out of people to fool. I didn't care. She could change her zip code, her name, her story. But she couldn't rewrite the ending. That was mine, and I wrote it with every choice I made, every truth I spoke, every time I woke up and decided to be more than what she tried to break. People often ask me if I feel sorry for her. I don't, because sorrow requires empathy, and empathy requires honesty, and my mother's currency was always fiction. I don't hate her, either. Hate takes energy, and I've already given her enough. What I feel now is distance. The kind you need to breathe. To grow. To live. This isn't a story about revenge. It's a story about survival, about voice, about the quiet, relentless decision to stop letting someone else define your reality. It's not pretty, it's not clean, but it's mine, and in the end, when the dust settled and the world stopped watching, that was the only victory that mattered.